Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's time again for another episode of Health Talks with Dr. Trinh. The one show, maybe the only show, that shows you a way towards a healthier life and the latest and greatest innovations taking place to help us reach that healthy life. With the man who lives nothing but a healthy life, doesn't eat any junk food, only does good things, a model of good behavior, Dr. Trinh. Welcome, sir.
Some junk food sometimes.
You do? Okay. All right. I didn't know that. I thought you were just the epitome of a paragon of healthy living here.
That question belongs to Dr. Edwards on how to save ourselves from COVID here.
Yes.
With everything going out in the news lately. Oh my word!
Isn't it? Are we going back? So welcome. Let's get our guest in here. Is it Dr. David Edwards? Did I get that correctly here?
That's right. Well, thank you so much. I'm really, really delighted to be here.
So I'm told, I nobody tells me till the last minute here, but I'm told that Dr. Edwards has a group that he founded. And forgive me, you just told me 3 times again here. I'll remember it again. What's the name of the organization, of the group?
The product is called FEND, F-E-N-D.
F-E-N-D. And does that have any particular meaning or stand for anything, or just a name you came up with?
It's really a word into itself, but it does have a lot to do with defense and generally fending for yourself.
And this is all about, we're talking about lungs, and we're talking about what to do with the lungs.
Well, it's really how to provide proper hygiene for the lungs. We've had hygiene for the hands for quite a long time. Of course, it took the Civil War for us to realize that hand hygiene really mattered to health, particularly to gut health. And now we've, because of the pandemic, discovered a hygiene for the lungs, which has a similar benefit to the lungs.
I didn't know that the Civil War is when we woke up and said we got to wash our hands. So prior to that, nobody knew, and we just had dirty hands, and we were constantly getting sick there, huh?
Yeah, interestingly, soap was around, obviously, for a very, very long time, but it was in the middle of the 19th century. And in our country, the gravity of the Civil War, it turned out that the soldiers who had soap in their backpacks had a higher likelihood of surviving the Civil War than not. So the first ivory soap came out right after the Civil War.
I didn't know that. Did you know that, Dr. Trinh? I grew up a big Civil War buff. I read about the Civil War. I never knew. I know it's the bloodiest Civil War in world history. Nobody's ever killed as many people of their own country as we did during that crazy conflict. But
so speaking about lungs,
yeah,
let me ask you. Originally, COVID spread through droplets. And now we're hearing more about airborne transmission. How do you define the two? Are they overlap? Are they different? Are they completely separate? Is it airborne? Is it droplets?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, unfortunately, terminology has confused a lot of people, and the reality is that scientists have been confused themselves. And so one of the challenges to reporting on or communicating around the pandemic is that we're really at a frontier of science, and so there's a matter of teaching people as scientists themselves are learning. But to answer the question very, very simply, hopefully, when any of us breathe or talks, not to mention sneezing or coughing, droplets come out of our respiratory system. And those droplets can be small, so small you can't see them, or they can be large enough to be seen. And since, of course, for the longest time, we could see the particles that we could see, and we could not see the particles that we couldn't see, the dogma around airborne transmission was anchored in what we could see. And so it was really believed that coughing and sneezing were the primary modes of transport of airborne infectious disease like TB or the flu, frankly. What's been learned over the last 25 years is that actually the worst particles are the ones you don't see. And that's true in general in the environment. That's why you have the PM 2.5. If you look at air quality in LA, and when it's bad, it's because these little particles you can't see are very numerous. It turns out that 80 to 90% of all particles in the air at any time are smaller than a micron. In other words, you can't see them. Anyway, those are the bad particles. So what has become clear is that in respect to COVID-19, probably the primary mode of transmission of the disease is by these very little droplets that come out of your airways when you speak, when you cough, but actually just when you normally breathe. And they're about, typically they're less than 1 micron in size, and they can travel very long distances. And they both transmit disease, and they also bring disease from your upper airways into your lower lungs and cause a more severe infection.
So airway, just air.
Yeah. No, maybe I didn't clearly enough state then that you should not really distinguish, in general, droplets that are coming out of our respiratory system. And by the way, Dr. Trinh, what we've really discovered here in the pandemic, that these are mostly coming out of your upper airways. So it's actually your larynx and just beyond your larynx. That's why and it's mostly coming out of the regions of the airways that hydrate the air that you breathe. And so that's a really important idea to bear in mind, that your upper airways, one of the roles of your upper airways is to filter stuff out of the air that you breathe, and to hydrate that air so that by the time it gets deep in the lungs, it's as clean as it can be and it's really wet.
Is that why they tend to, we all tend to think of them as water droplets that are spraying through the air?
Totally. And they are water droplets. They have other things in them, but for sure. And so hydration is something we'll talk a lot about, hopefully, in this conversation.
So let's try and get to the heart of the meat of the matter here, and then we'll go through all these, the current COVID craziness and confusion that's confounding us here these days. Your product does what?
Yeah, what does my product do? Well, if you bear with me for 2 minutes, just to say that my background, I invented a way of delivering insulin to the lungs in the 90s, and led to a platform that came to produce the first inhaled L-DOPA for Parkinson's disease. So I've been really involved in how do you get drugs into the lungs. When the anthrax scare happened in the early 2000s, the question became, well, if we can do that with drugs, could we do it with any pathogen? And the question was, how do you protect people from any pathogen? And that's when I made the observation that led to the product. What was the observation? When you put salt and water in the airways, you can eliminate these little droplets that we've been talking about. And so
that's simple. We put salt in your airways?
Yeah, crazy. It's crazy that it's so simple, and I'll explain to you why that's true. These are salts that are in your body. By the way, they're also salts that are in the ocean, and the reason why they're both in the ocean and the water in your lungs is that the ocean is constantly producing salt droplets. And those droplets not only expose you in Southern California, but pretty much anywhere on Earth, there is salt in the air that you breathe. And that salt is coming from the ocean. 2/3 of the planet is covered by ocean. And so there's a lot of salt in the air. And so those salts are also in your lungs. And it turns out that the hydration of the upper airways is regulated in your bodies by a balance of salt and water. And so what we found is that, and I'll explain this more, is that by placing salt, and particularly what we found here in the pandemic is if you place it right here in the upper airways, and you can do so by breathing it in through your nose, you can radically reduce the number of these respiratory droplets that you generate for several hours having breathed them in.
And does this kill them so they don't go into your lung and you get sick, or you don't expel them and make others sick, or both?
Yeah, it's really both of them. And so, in fact, if you think about hand washing, it's a really good analogy to come back to. Hand washing is good for you, and it's good for anybody who shakes your hand. And so there's a very similar thing here. But to be really clear, and I should say something just so your listeners understand how the upper airways work. So long before COVID-19 and long before the FDA, the lungs faced dirty air, and people were burning fires in caves and all kinds of things. And so the lungs have a method for cleaning the air, and it is these upper airways. And so what happens is when you breathe in particles, pathogen, whatever it is, the highest likelihood is it falls out in your nose. It falls out in your trachea and your main bronchi, these upper airways where gas exchange doesn't occur. And so what you have there is a layer of mucus, an airway lining fluid. It captures these particles, and if everything works right, it sweeps them to the mouth by cilia, and you swallow the particles soon after you have inhaled them, and then you're okay. And so that's how it's supposed to work. Now, when and we've learned a lot here in the pandemic, that there's a lot of conditions during the course of a day and during the course of a life that make your mucus not work well. And suddenly it begins to break up when you're breathing. And then it leads to these droplets, and it can carry anything, including pathogen, deeper into your lungs or into the outside environment, and you don't want that to happen. So what FEND does is it puts these salts in your upper airways to hydrate them and to prevent this droplet breakup from happening. And now you might say, well, how does that work?
Right.
So in fact, what we've discovered, and we have a paper that's, we've published 5 papers since the beginning of the pandemic. We have 2 more that are in review right now. And one of these, we're showing that when you breathe really dry air, it happens to be true when you can imagine, if the upper airways are supposed to hydrate the air and clean it, if you're breathing really dry air or very polluted air, it's bad. And that's true.
Either one, polluted air I get, but what was the other? So if it's really dry air?
Why does dry air? Okay, so let me explain the dry air problem. So this is, by the way, really well known. It's very well, it was known before the pandemic that breathing really dry air is bad for asthma, it's bad for COPD, it's bad for flu, and it turns out to be bad for COVID-19. So it raises risks, and the question is why? Well, one of the reasons that we're finding is the following: that when you breathe really dry air, your upper airways have to evaporate a lot of water. Thins out, and when that thins out, a lot of bad things happen. One, the cilia start to move slowly because it's all viscous, and the surface of the mucus becomes weak, and it begins to break up easily on breathing. And so anything that dries out the airways leads to a lot more respiratory droplets being formed. So when you hydrate the airways, so when you put salt into the airways, you create something we call an osmotic pressure, which pulls water out of the cells in the upper airways to hydrate the upper airways. And that happens every day. And so all that you're doing when you're delivering salt is you're helping the airways do what it wants to do, but you're compensating for any effects that may have been drying out the airways or polluting them. What do you think, Dr. Trinh?
You're improving the health of the airway by delivering salt because of that osmotic effect. It's drawing all that intracellular fluid out, right?
Exactly.
Protecting the airway. I got it. And so that helps with viruses and pandemics.
Yeah. So we when the pandemic began, myself and my former advisor at MIT, Bob Langer, who was the head of the scientific advisory board for many years at the FDA, we went to Janet Woodcock, who oversees the drug division. And we had a lot of data that we'd collected over the years, and then my new work on nasal delivery. And because salts that you deliver through the nose are regulated by the FDA, or can be, as cosmetics or cleansers, there was
like nasal sprays or something like that. Yeah, clean your nose out or something. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so there's an opportunity to get into human testing right away, which we did. And so we've been focused mostly, Dr. Trinh, just until now, in studies that have been looking at can we clean the airways, and we have a lot of data showing yes, and showing why the airways get dirty. Now that raises the question, so what? Does it matter to my own infection, or does it matter to me infecting others? And so the 2 papers that we have coming out right now, and I can't get into too much detail, but I'll say that the product was immediately brought to India. So India obviously has had a massive, and continues to have a massive health challenge. It began last spring. And so we have been doing studies at Bangalore Baptist Hospital. And the woman, quite a hero, there's a lot of heroes over there right now in the healthcare system, who leads, she actually leads healthcare for 1 million people in the slum, DJ Holly slum of Bangalore. Wow. Has been studying what happens when you deliver this hygiene to the airways of both non-infected and infected patients. And so the infection work began in December. And then at the time, the primary variant was Alpha. And by March, they were in a full-blown health crisis. Her entire, or at least 4 of her technicians in her PCR lab died, right? And so everybody had been vaccinated, and most everybody had breakthrough infection. A crazily horrible situation. And so they decided to begin using FEND in a treatment study. And so basically, incoming mildly symptomatic COVID-19 patients were received in a random control study, either a simply saline product for the nose 3 times a day, or they took FEND 3 times a day. And I can't get into too much data, but just to say that the results were really surprising, and the effect was really significant in terms of the treatment effect for the COVID-19 patients.
So let me see as an everyman if I can drill down and just ask a question, and Dr. Trinh, and you can get technical again here. All right. So what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, is that this upper airway has lots of mucus, and the mucus grabs this bad stuff, even COVID or flu or other things, and somehow then passes it down to what? My gut, so it leaves my body that way?
Yeah. So in the perfect immune system scenario, inhaled pathogens land on your mucus, get swept to your mouth, and you swallow it. And generally, it passes through the gut, high acid, and it passes out, and you generally have no symptoms. So that's the normal, healthy path. And so most infections since the beginning of the pandemic have been asymptomatic, meaning that you get infected in your upper airways, but the infection needs to get deep in your lungs for you to have symptoms, generally. Now, the question is, how does it get deep in the lungs? And one way it does, because all the movement in the lungs is the other way. And so how does it get deep in the lungs? And well, one way is that it gets back in the air, and then it goes deep because it comes in the air, and there's these very, very little droplets. So we began to notice.
So if I don't trap it on the way in to my mouth, I breathe in my nose or my mouth. If I don't trap, the mucus doesn't trap it, it could go deep into my lungs, and now I got serious infection symptoms. But if it goes into my gut, if I swallow it, chances are I don't get sick and I don't have any infection.
That's generally true. And this same logic obviously holds for any airborne pathogen, but also allergens and also carcinogens, right? So this notion of a hygiene that's cleaning away the vector of transmission, both to your own lungs and the outside environment. And so you want to clean them. And so that's what we're doing. We're cleaning these respiratory droplets. And so we're not at all killing the bug any more than soap kills the bug on your hands. It's just washing away the contaminants.
Very, very good analogy. So I wash my hands to get rid of any bugs before I do anything else. Before I touch a patient and examine a patient, I wash my hands because it cleans my hands. So Dr. Edwards, you're talking about washing your lung linings to clean out any potential contaminant before it gets to the lungs.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And one thing, Dr. Trinh, which is your listeners may tune into, salt and water are in the air, and they're even more prominently in the air when you're near the sea. And so you might assume that there's some airway hygiene that happens when you're near the coastline. And
like here in Southern California, I mean, you can smell the sea air. You can,
totally. So what we have 2 papers that are under review, and in the second, we did an ecological regression analysis with my colleague at Harvard School of Public Health here, and looked at whether it might be true in looking at the COVID-19 cases and deaths since the start of the pandemic up through March, when vaccination really took hold, whether you might see a salt and water exposure effect, and particularly on the Pacific coast and the Gulf Coast, where you have significant winds off the sea. And so the airborne exposure to salt is high. We do see an effect, and again, I can't get into the detail, it's peer reviewed, but
so we get less sick here, or less tendency to get the bug.
It's interesting. There's a lot of confounding factors, and so it is true, as we show in the paper, that on the Pacific coast there's a lesser incidence of COVID-19 per capita and deaths. But it happens to be because of a lot of other factors. But there is, if you subtract those other factors out, like who's living next to the sea, economic and political and sort of environmental factors, if you subtract those out, you do see that there's a water and salt exposure effect. these are first results, but I just want to point out that when your listeners think about, well, what can I do to protect myself? There's some things that you can do just in the course of your natural day. And
go down to the ocean and hang out there.
Yeah,
no.
yeah. Or if you're in an air-conditioned environment, humidify the air, right?
Yeah,
so I think there's some basic principles, but on this topic of salt and the sea, that there's obviously a very, very, very long history of humanity and its observation that it seems to be helpful for people who have respiratory issues to be in salty environments.
Yeah, go down to the ocean when you had people with tuberculosis and stuff. Didn't they send them to the beach and I don't know why, to sanitariums? Yeah.
You know what, Paul? I think Jenny and I went to this place in Irvine where we had a Groupon, and we went to this room, and the deal was we were breathing in like some salt. What was it?
Halotherapy.
Yeah, halotherapy. We just sat there and breathed in some salt stuff. And I was like, is this voodoo? But we paid for it because it's Groupon.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But
and
did that work? There's a science
but that's so interesting you bring that up. Yeah. So in fact, and I just want to, before I go on further, say that in this region of hygiene or non-therapeutic intervention, it's super important to be grounded in peer-reviewed science because it's easy to market lots of things. And so
the truth? Say that again. Science helps a little bit. Don't just buy every voodoo trick that somebody offers here.
Yeah. So in our case, we've been, since the beginning of the pandemic, keeping a very low profile and just getting data. And so I just want to say that. And so now to come back to what you just described, in the middle 19th century, when industrialization began to really take hold in Europe, respiratory diseases of the kind we have now massively around the world.
Because smokestacks are sending smog and soot into the air.
Basically, there was both a combination of smokestacks and people flooding cities. And what began to be observed is that there was this growth in respiratory diseases, and it was also observed that some of the people who were not looking to be sick were the salt mine workers. And so it became a tradition to take those with chronic respiratory diseases and to bring them down to the salt mines and to have them spend the nights there. And they began to observe that there was some positive effects. And so that's a whole tradition in Europe still. But halotherapy is actually a contemporary translation of that. And so in a halotherapy environment, you have a very, very, and these are really salty environments, much more salty than you get near the sea. And the few benefits potentially, and there is some data that suggests that they are helpful, but there has not been a really careful random control study, to be honest, about this. But there is some data that suggests that they are helpful. And there's at least a few reasons for that. One is the salt effects that we're describing. Salts in the lungs both eliminate respiratory droplet generation, but they also speed up cilia movement, and so that's also helpful.
Cilia is what, the little fibers or something?
Yeah, the cilia are what move the particles. That's what moves the mucus towards the mouth, and so if it's faster, it kind of cleans your airways faster. The other thing that's true in those environments is that they tend to have no allergens or fomites and things that you might be infecting you, and I can't really remember what the third advantage would be, but anyway, that's what those are.
So leave it to Dr. Trinh to know something, to go someplace and pay people money just to smell salty air.
They took my money.
It took your money.
Smell salty air.
So what do you think, Dr. Trinh? I'm just sitting here. I have 100 questions, but I want to hear from you.
How do you what does an average daily person do to apply what you're teaching us here?
Okay, so I have a FEND here with me, so I'll just demonstrate it for you. It looks like this. There's actually a very small pocket version of this that will be very expensive, that will come out very inexpensive, that will come out here this fall. So
I like the inexpensive versus the expensive one. I like the
and then it's all of it reduces to about 10 cents per administration. So this is salt water after all, but this is a little bit less easy to put in your pocket. So anyway, when you turn it over, it creates a cloud. Okay. And this is a salt mist, and the droplets are just the right size so that when you breathe them through your nose, they deposit right here in the trachea, which is where you want them. And so the administration should be 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and night. Lasts for about 6 hours, and it takes about 10 seconds. So you create the cloud in front of your nose, and then you do a very deep nasal inhalation.
Right.
And you do that twice. And that's the
and how often? Hourly, daily, weekly?
3 times a day. 3 times a day. Yeah, it's every 6 hours.
So forgive me, Dr. Edwards, but this sounds pretty wild and fantastic to just an average Joe like me listening to this. It sounds that this could help prevent me from getting sick because it makes my passages more moist, and they suck out more bad stuff as it comes into my mouth and nose.
Yeah, and I mean, well, I'm
not trying to challenge you. I'm just trying to. I just got to say honestly, I think people are the same. We're all looking with our mouth open, like, really? I mean, it's
So I will be in Southern California in the end of September. There's a conference, Life Itself. LifeItself.health that Sanjay Gupta and Mark Hodash are overseeing. Sanjay Gupta from CNN.
Yeah, sure.
And so if you check that out, I'm speaking on this, and we'll be bringing out this new product, and Tony Fauci and Bill Gates and others are there. And so
is this something only for the elite, or can everyday people watch this, stream it?
Well, I'd be really happy to do a special sort of appearance and product distribution for anybody in Southern California who's interested. But it'll be in late September. And anyway, that's a really big moment, and we'll be much more public at that point. And these 2 articles that I just mentioned will also have come out by then. So.
Let me ask 2 more questions. I know Dr. Trin's dying to get in here, but I got to. You just blowing my mind with this thing here. So 2 things. 1, I didn't know that dry air is potentially bad for you because it dries out your mucus. The general assumption is if you've got asthma or some other respiratory problem, you historically went to dry climates. You went to Arizona. You went out to the desert. That was supposed to be cleaner air, and so I always thought dry air is good for you. Here in Southern California, you go out to the desert, to Palm Springs or whatever. That's where people retire, and that's supposed. You're saying no, that's harder on your respiratory system?
All things equal, a low humidity environment, we're talking 10 to 20% humidity, relative humidity is bad for your respiratory health. Yes, there are other benefits to being in the desert in terms of what is in the air. Right, and so there is kind of what I pointed out in terms of the halotherapy environment. But this that I'm describing here is actually really well known in the scientific community. And so there's a real movement right now to get the WHO to acknowledge the importance of humidity. You want a 40 to 60% relative humidity environment. Higher than that leads to risks of fomite infection and other things like that. But
so how about these other humid climates? I'm thinking New Orleans or Houston in the summer, or Michigan, where I grew up, that it felt like you were in a hot sauna when you walked out in August.
Yeah. And so that's what, again, the study, there is quite a bit of data, Paul, that has come out on COVID-19 specifically, showing that humid environments are lower the risk of symptoms than dry environments. So this is a pretty well known. And the study that we have coming out is also confirming that there are benefits to Gulf Coast, and Pacific Coast is a less humid environment, actually.
Right. Yeah, because it's more arid. I mean, even though we're close to the ocean, it's an arid environment here.
Yeah. We have a question on Facebook here. Zach asks, does the FEND therapy work any better or worse for those who are immune compromised?
Yeah, really good. I just want to clarify, let's avoid the word therapy, because this is think about washing your hands. So is FEND Hygiene, is it good for the immunocompromised? So it's maybe
it's just a routine. It's something to do, like washing your hands, to help cleanse your body here. Right?
Yeah, you can imagine that anything. So you can think of this as helping your immune system, right? And so your immune system includes this mucus defense that I just described. And so anything that is helping that mucus defense work better for anybody who has immunocompromised and certainly immunocompromised lungs, it's a really, really good thing to do.
Yeah, the mucus layer is the first line of defense.
Yeah, that's right. People, again, there's a lot more talked about when it comes to the gut mucus. And so everybody knows that as you age and you eat poorly, the gut mucus breaks down and you can get infection. Well, that turns out to be true in the airways too. So
here's my other question. I'll see if I can get another couple in here. So you've cleared up one misperception. I thought dry desert air good for you. You're saying not for your lungs necessarily, because it's drying out your mucus here. You need a more humid environment somehow, and preferably one that has salt in it, like near the ocean type of thing.
That's right.
All right. Having said that, I'm wondering then, why was so much attention paid in the beginning to me washing my hands, not washing my lungs? Why are we worried about me taking this and sticking it in as if it was that's the transmission method? I touch somebody, they give it to me, and I touch it. I guess I touch my nose or something, or my eye or somewhere into my mucus. Is that it? Yeah.
So really good. Well, let me first clarify your first point. If you're practicing airway hygiene, you can be anywhere. You can be in Bangalore, you can be in Tucson, you can be wherever, and your airways are hydrated. So there are ways to hydrate your airways wherever you are. I just want to make that clear. Yes, in fact, this point that at the beginning of the pandemic, we were saying, wash your hands, and we all remember
and
how
don't touch and don't shake hands, and
and we had employees who were hired to clean surfaces every 2 hours away.
Right.
Well, we've learned, and so that's my point, that the science has learned a lot here over the last 18 months. And so the hand washing is always a good idea, right? It was true before and it's true after. But as far as COVID-19 is concerned, the relevance of hand washing is slim, right? And so you need COVID-19 to get into the air. And its probability of moving from your hands into the air is quite a bit smaller than from moving from one person's.
So touching somebody and like a germ, and the germ is now on my hand, and then the theory was I accidentally rubbed my eye,
and that's true. And that's true, by the way. And so there is so SARS-CoV-2, the virus of COVID-19, can proliferate on mucosal surfaces, and one is the eye. Right. Yeah. And so you can get infection in the eye. And so if the goal is to avoid infection in the eye, hand washing is a good idea. Okay. And so you might say, well, why would I not want to avoid that? And you're right. You should want to avoid it. But getting infection in the eye is not tantamount to getting symptoms of COVID-19. So for symptoms
of COVID-19, you got to get it in your lungs there somewhere.
It needs to get in your lower airways. Yeah.
What's inside what's the water or the liquid inside the FEND product? Is it salt?
It's salt and water. So
that's what JC really knee on our one of our.
To be really clear, so normal salines are sodium chloride salt, which is what table salt is, and it's at isotonic, typically the concentration of your lungs or of your body, basically. There are some hypertonic salts, and those are basically sodium chloride at high concentrations, and those are the ones that cause the cilia to beat faster. So our composition is calcium chloride. Or magnesium chloride, actually. And both of those salts are in the body. They're both in the ocean. They're very high in concentration in the Dead Sea. And it turns out the
Dead Sea's not so dead. Maybe that's the place to go here.
I've been in the Dead Sea, floating around. You don't have to swim. You just
That's right. That's right. And so, so the fact is that when you use so calcium and magnesium, as you know, are divalent cations. So they happen to prolong the hydration of your upper airways. And so if we were just putting in sodium chloride salts at hypertonic concentrations, you'd have to do this every hour. But here we can do it just once every 6 hours.
And that's because of the magnesium or manganese?
Calcium, right now it's calcium, but magnesium works too.
Right.
All right.
How's this different than a steam facial inhaler?
Yeah, right.
To
A
moisturize
mask, you know, there's what do they have, these
Oh,
CPAP
great
things that are
thing.
supposed to clear out your airways and stuff, or help you breathe when you're having irregular breathing and all this stuff. Is
or
that
like a hot steam bath. How's
Yeah.
that?
any of those
Yeah.
things?
So-
Inhalers, the masks. Yeah.
So,
right.
so there, so there are clearly many environments where you can be exposed to salt and water, and they can be very helpful. What is critical for a product like FEND to be effective in the way that I described, it's easy to use and it lasts for a long time, are two things. It's important that the composition be right. And so there is a particular composition that makes this work, and this concentration of calcium or magnesium salt. And the second thing is that the droplet size needs to be right. So we're the first to make droplets that are 10 microns in size. And so that happens to be large enough so that it won't get into your lower airways, which is important. It
doesn't bypass this mucus and go right into the lower part of your lung. It gets absorbed.
Right. It stops where the pathogen stops, basically, and so it lands right here in your upper airway. So the design of the droplet really matters. So, which is not to say that if I'm walking along the seaside, I'm not going to get exposure to my upper airways. It's just not going to be particularly targeted, and so I have to really spend a lot of time next to the sea for this effect to show up.
What powers it? Is there a battery in there? What takes this and atomizes it? Yeah.
Right. In the FEND product that you can go online, it's hellofund.com, by the way, and buy.
Hello, FEND.
Hello, FEND, exactly. So there's two AA batteries, and they last for several months, basically. In the product that will come out in later September, there are no batteries, and it has it is a
it's solar powered. No, it's not. No,
no, it's a pump spray. It's a pump spray, actually.
It's a pump spray, so it's just like a regular atomizer. I just pump it.
Yeah, it's an unusual. You'll see, it's quite unusual. It's quite beautiful and inexpensive, but it doesn't have it doesn't have glass. So this is really, really effective. People are using it. A lot of families, actually in Southern California. Our biggest purchasers are in California, by the way.
Look at Dr. Trinh. He already tried something like this on a Groupon. Yeah. We'll go for any of this stuff. Yeah.
This is typically.
I want to sample when you're out here in September.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you got it. Well, you can.
Where is the conference? Where are you at in September? What city, or LA, or?
I'm in San Diego. Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
But we have a lot of friends in LA, so we'll probably be there too. But people are typically using it, families, and they typically sit this on the kitchen counter, and everybody can use it because it doesn't touch you. It doesn't touch you. Many people can use it. And
then do I have to buy your special goop, your special formula?
Right. Yeah. So with this product, you buy you get little replacement bottles of the solution, and like I said, the cost per administration is about 10 cents.
Now, do you envision people? Is this the new thing everybody's going to carry with them constantly, 24/7?
Yeah.
Because COVID will go away someday. We assume. But other things will come, and there's still the flu, and there's other,
but there's also wildfires, right? So let me just really be clear that the data is really very strong that polluted air raises the risks of respiratory disease across the board, right? And so we did one of our studies in LA, in a film studio in LA, and we've done a lot of studies in Bangalore. In those two cities, this was last September in the midst of the fire season, and the air quality was really not good. And we've had two sets of subjects who had very, very, very high levels of respiratory droplets over the last year, and those were in Bangalore and LA. So exposure to a lot of particles in the air is bad for your mucus.
That's why they say stay indoors when the fire's raging and the air is all smoky. They ask you to stay indoors.
But you should just generally, in any environment where you're exposed to bad stuff, you should be using airway hygiene for long-term respiratory health.
What do you think, Dr. Trinh? Are doctors aware of hygiene, airway hygiene?
Airway hygiene is underreported. It's huge, and I've seen, in the world of Alzheimer's, we do Alzheimer's clinical trials where I'm at. there are reports that if you live in areas of high pollution, your risk for Alzheimer's is higher than those who live in an area of low pollution. And so that's the toxins that are coming in, right?
Yeah.
You're hoping to clean out.
Yeah. Well, so this another conversation maybe next time I'm out there. This delivery system obviously is really relevant to the olfactory system, and olfactory system is really relevant to Alzheimer's. And so there's a real tight connection between the nose and the brain and memory. And so
I got to stop you there. I had no idea. So my olfactory, my nose and my nasal passage is up behind my eyes and all this cavities. I guess that's because it bumps up against the brain.
It's the only sensory nerve that goes directly to the brain is the olfactory nerve, and there's two synapses between the olfactory receptor and your hippocampus region, basically. And
that's the front part of your brain. The hippocampus is the front part of your brain, or is that the
memory aspect of your brain?
Okay,
it's actually also how COVID gets up there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
It's why you lose taste and smell. It's why one of the first symptoms is the loss of smell, right?
You're making all this light bulbs are going on all across Southern California.
The virus gets into your nasal cavity, and then here's your olfactory nerve from your brain just dangling inside the nasal cavity area. So the virus gets up into your olfactory nerve, destroys the ability to smell, and heads up to the brain. It's why you lose your...
The obvious question as we wrap up in the last 5 minutes or so is, why isn't this front page news? We chased down this silly hydrochlorodoxine or whatever, whatever this other crazy thing was. We chased that down till everybody said, quit it. We've looked at 18,000 other goofy online ideas. Why isn't this front page news?
Yeah, well,
or will it be?
I think so. I think, honestly, to be fair to the media and to the science normally doesn't work this way, right? Where kind of discoveries of science are 2 days later being communicated on, and then 2 days after that, people are supposed to be doing a new practice, and not just a small group, but like everybody. And so it's put a lot of pressure on journalists to kind of not listen if they don't have all the
facts.
Right. And so anything that's new is it's worrisome. So I think that so it has been frustrating to watch, but I'm hopeful that we're getting to a point. And I'm talking really frequently now to media, and I'm hopeful that people will be getting better news soon.
Anybody doubting this? Anybody that's going to write in right now and say, no, this isn't true? What's this guy talking about? I know this, or whatever.
What about the nasal saline rinse? Does that have any effects on mucosal and all that stuff?
Yeah, so nasal salines have, as you know, thousands and thousands of years of history, and so there is totally benefit to nasal salines. It's not the same benefit, and they're generally for cleaning mucus, and particularly hypertonic nasal salines make cilia move faster, but they're not like the Medipot and so forth. They're not targeting this trachea and main bronchi, so they're not really having any effect on these respiratory droplets. And in fact, all of our clinical studies to date have used nasal salines as control. Ooh. And so it's a good thing to do, but it's not the airway hygiene that I'm referring to.
So I'll go back
I know that the CDC has cited your research. Yeah, in its advice about COVID and all that.
Yeah.
So tell us more about that.
Yeah. Well, as I alluded to, in the process of understanding how FEND works, we've learned a lot about how respiratory droplets form. And so we published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a few months ago a study that showed that that in a group of 100 people, you typically have 20 of those people who are breathing out 80% of the aerosol of the group. In other words, what we found is that typically in any group, you have a super spreader-like distribution of aerosol particle. And so it is highly suggestive that one of the underlying factors of super spreading is propensity to produce droplets. And so that raises the question, well, why do some people produce more droplets than others? And what we found in that paper, we showed that, well, age and BMI, so the older you are and the more heavy you are, the higher the likelihood that you produce more droplets. It doesn't mean that if you're old or if you have high BMI that you produce a lot of droplets, but the probability goes up. We also show, and this is even more important, that lung infection, and we showed for COVID-19, but also for TB, when you're infected, the number of droplets goes up a lot. And I can explain why that's true, actually. It's a really, really interesting. So that is fundamental. So what happens is when you get infected, and it seems to be true with the flu or any lung infection, suddenly your airways are producing a lot of respiratory droplets, which gets to why the virus survives. So there's clearly a survival thing that's happened here as viruses and bacteria have evolved. Yeah, so the CDC was citing that in their acknowledgement that these respiratory droplets are very likely the primary mode of transmission.
So if you're heavier, you might have a propensity to generate more, to spew more stuff into the air,
or into your own lungs. Right, so you might have a high risk
up or down. And
yeah.
Then the minute you get sick, well, good news for everybody who's sick, now you're more likely to spread it, not just because you got it, because you're pushing more out into the air.
That's right. And that's, again, just another reason to, of course, it's why we self-isolate. But here, airway hygiene. So we can talk for a long time, but one of our papers, we had an interesting, just before we published, one of the team members, his wife became COVID positive. And so she and the family had to quarantine. And so we brought a particle counter into their home, and they took FEND and they measured their exhaled aerosol. So super interesting. And that everybody breathes out, say, 100 particles per liter, which is not many, but she was producing like 3,000 or 4,000 particles per liter. FEND would bring it down every day, but then once she got to day 10 of her infection, suddenly her respiratory droplets fell down to 100. And so she was high, and then just went right down. And so there's this fascinating issue. And I think, honestly, that as time goes on, we will eventually be detecting and using the detection of these droplets as a means for assessing our respiratory health.
Well, you have given more for thought. I got 193 people right now on Facebook, and they're all mute like I am with their mouth wide open. Probably not a good thing to do because we're inhaling more stuff. But we're all like, we can't believe it. How do they find out more about you? Where do they go for information about this to learn more?
So my personal website is davidideas.com, and we are starting an educational campaign next week. By the way, if anybody's interested, just check in davidideas.com, and the product is at hellofend.com.
David Ideas, the ideas from David, and Hello Fend.
Nice. Do you feel like and I like there's a comment here on Facebook about hand washing, especially in the hospital or in restaurants and things of that sort. Do you feel like we should have a more systematic way to confirm compliance with these, public health mandates such as hand washings and things of that
whatever
sort?
The protocols, whatever they were putting in place, wearing a mask, washing your hand, spraying up your nose. Yeah, right.
In the ER, in the hospital, the restaurants.
Yeah, I think in the nearest term, enforcement is important and in some cases urgent. In the long term, when it comes to things like hygiene, there's a culture that we need to learn. And I mentioned the Civil War as being a culture-defining moment when it comes to hygiene. I'm sure that the pandemic is for us. So I think as frustrating as it for all of us who see those who are perhaps not practicing hygiene properly, there's nothing like a pandemic to get us all kind of on the same. So I'm hopeful that the culture is changing.
Well, you have changed some minds and opened some ideas here. David Ideas is a place worth checking out. And certainly FEND, Hello FEND.
FEND. I like that.
Hello FEND. Can we ever get you back again? Because you have raised about 1,000 issues that we could go deeper into here. Like, does this help fend off other things? You briefly alluded to other things. And you, I don't know whether Dr. Trinh and you know each other prior to this, but, you know, his research in Alzheimer's, he's on the board of Alzheimer's here in Orange County. You know, I'd love to hear more about how this sort of delivery system that you developed before works to deliver whatever that drug is you mentioned about Alzheimer's too. Yeah.
So many indications potentially with that.
Well, I look forward to our next conversation, and thank you both. Really, thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, hang on after the line. We'll get some other information. We'll connect the two of you together
great.
here, and we'll wrap this up. And take us out, Dr. Trinh. What do you think? This is mind-blowing.
All right, guys. Very great session today with Dr. Edwards here. The importance that hasn't been highlighted in the community or in the United States with lung hygiene, pulmonary hygiene. Just as you wash your hands, you can simply kind of wash your lungs, and this needs to be brought out to the public, especially
Amen.
in OC Talk.
Amen. Right
Thank
here.
you so much.
Thanks so much. Hang on, everybody here. Well, hold on to your hats. We got more of these kinds of things coming up each and every week. Mind-blowing stuff, ideas about how to improve your health. Like, hello, FEND. Here in Orange County's only community radio station, octalkradio.net. Streaming live from the Cove here at the University of California, Irvine's Beale Applied Innovation Center.